January 16, 1920. At exactly midnight, the United States of America made a decision that would change everything forever. With the stroke of a pen, politicians believed they could control human nature itself. With a single law, they banned alcohol across the entire nation. The Volstead Act was now in effect. Prohibition had begun. What they called the Noble Experiment was about to become America's greatest failure and the greatest opportunity criminals had ever seen. What naive politicians called their moral victory, experienced criminals immediately recognized as the opportunity of a lifetime. Overnight, a legal industry worth billions became an illegal gold mine. And nowhere in America was this golden opportunity greater than in Chicago, a city already drowning in corruption, where police badges were bought and sold like candy, where aldermen took bribes over breakfast, and where the mayor himself was rumored to be on organized crime's payroll. By day, Chicago looked like any other American city. Families going to work in the stockyards and steel mills, children playing stickball in the streets, immigrants chasing the American dream, people living what appeared to be ordinary, honest lives. Church bells rang on Sunday mornings and the Cubs played baseball at Wrigley Field. But when darkness fell over the windy city, Chicago transformed into something else entirely. A different world emerged from the shadows, a playground for gangsters where Tommy guns spoke louder than law, a battlefield for criminals where territory was marked in blood, a kingdom waiting for its king, and that crown was about to be claimed by the most unlikely candidate America had ever seen. And that king had a name, Alfonso Gabriel Capone. But here's what they don't tell you in history books, what the newspapers never reported, what even the FBI files kept classified for decades. This wasn't just another street thug who got lucky. This was a criminal mastermind who understood something that law enforcement completely missed: the power of public image. While other gangsters hid in shadows, Capone stepped into the spotlight. While others avoided cameras, he posed for them. While others feared the press, he charmed them. He didn't just want to control Chicago's underworld. He wanted to control Chicago's heart and mind. The same man who personally funded soup kitchens that fed over 1,000 hungry Chicagoans every single day had personally ordered the brutal execution of 7 men in a single morning that shocked the entire nation. The same man who kissed babies at public rallies, who donated to orphanages, who paid for strangers' medical bills, controlled a violent empire built on blood, fear, and unimaginable brutality. How is this possible? How does a human mind compartmentalize such extreme contradictions? How do you serve soup to children in the afternoon and order executions before dinner? This is the story of America's greatest criminal contradiction, a paradox that defied every rule of human psychology. A man who lived not one life, but 2 completely separate existences that should have been impossible to maintain. By day, he was Alfonso Capone, the beloved philanthropist, the family man, the successful businessman who embodied the American dream. By night, he was Scarface, the ruthless killer, the criminal mastermind, the monster who ruled through terror and violence. For 7 incredible years, he convinced an entire city, an entire nation, that these 2 men were somehow the same person. A monster who convinced the world he was a hero and almost succeeded in making them believe it. For 7 incredible years, Al Capone didn't just rule Chicago's underworld, he ruled Chicago's imagination and eventually America's consciousness. He understood something that modern PR experts are still trying to master: control the narrative, and you control reality. To the press, he was the colorful character who always had a quote ready. To the public, he was Robin Hood in a pinstripe suit, taking from the rich government and giving to the poor people. To his enemies, he was the Sheriff of Nottingham, ruthless and unstoppable. Somehow, impossibly, he was both hero and villain, protector and predator, savior and destroyer, all rolled into one unforgettable, undeniable, larger-than-life American legend. But how? How does a poor immigrant kid from Brooklyn, a 6th-grade dropout with a scarred face and a violent temper, transform himself into both America's most beloved criminal and its most feared monster? How do you hide a double life when the whole world is watching your every move? when FBI agents are following you, when reporters are documenting your daily activities? How do you convince mothers to bring their children to see you while simultaneously ordering the execution of your enemies? What kind of psychological manipulation, what kind of strategic genius, what kind of sheer audacity does it take to pull off the greatest con in American criminal history? And perhaps most disturbing of all, if Al Capone could fool an entire nation for 7 years, who else might be fooling us right now? Today, we're going deeper than any documentary has ever gone before. We're uncovering the psychology behind the mask, the strategy behind the deception, and the shocking truth behind Al Capone's impossible double life. Using newly discovered FBI files, exclusive interviews with historians, and psychological analysis from criminal behavior experts, we'll reveal exactly how he did it and why it worked so perfectly for so long. This is the story they never taught you in school. The story that will change everything you thought you knew about America's most famous criminal. So buckle up, because we're about to enter the twisted, brilliant, terrifying mind of Al Capone. January 17, 1899. In a cramped tenement apartment in Brooklyn's Navy Yard district, Gabriele and Teresa Capone welcomed their fourth child into the world. They named him Alfonso, after Teresa's father back in Italy. Like millions of other Italian immigrants, they had come to America with nothing but hope and a willingness to work. Gabriele was a barber who dreamed of opening his own shop. Teresa took in laundry to help feed their growing family. They were honest, hard-working people who believed in the American dream. They had no idea they had just given birth to America's most notorious criminal. But here's what makes Al Capone's story so fascinating and so terrifying. The same values that made his parents model immigrants would later become the foundation of his criminal empire. Young Alfonso was a contradiction from the very beginning. At home, he was the perfect Italian son, respectful to his parents, protective of his younger siblings, a boy who never missed Sunday Mass and always said his prayers before bed. His mother, Teresa, would later tell reporters that Al was a good boy who just fell in with the wrong crowd. But even at age 10, Alfonso Capone was already learning to wear different masks for different audiences. At PS7, his elementary school, teachers saw a quiet, average student who caused no trouble. He wasn't brilliant, but he wasn't disruptive either. He blended in perfectly. But after school? That's when the other Alfonso emerged. The one his family never saw, the one his teachers never suspected. The streets of Brooklyn were Alfonso's real education. While other kids played marbles and flew kites, Al was studying a different curriculum: extortion, intimidation, and the art of calculated violence. By age 12, he was running with the South Brooklyn Rippers, a juvenile gang that specialized in petty theft and vandalism. By 14, he had graduated to more serious crews, first the 40 Thieves Juniors, then the notorious 5 Points gang in Manhattan. But here's what separated Al from every other street kid in Brooklyn. He never lost control. While other boys fought out of anger or desperation, Al fought with purpose. While they stole to survive, he stole to build something bigger. He was already thinking like a businessman, even when his business was crime. Everything changed when Alfonso met Johnny Torrio. Torrio was everything young Al aspired to become: a successful criminal who dressed like a gentleman, spoke like a businessman, and never got his own hands dirty. While other gang leaders ruled through fear and brutality, Torrio controlled through intelligence and strategy. He saw something special in the teenage Alfonso Capone, something that none of the other gang bosses had noticed. Here was a kid who could be both charming and terrifying, who could think 3 moves ahead, who understood that the real power wasn't in the gun, it was in making people believe you'd never use it. Torrio became Al's mentor, his father figure, and ultimately, the man who would teach him the most important lesson of his criminal career. Always keep your public face separate from your private business. But before Alfonso Capone could become the master of deception, he had to learn his first hard lesson about the consequences of letting his mask slip. It was the summer of 1917, and 18-year-old Al was working as a bouncer at Frankie Yale's Harvard Inn, a rough speakeasy and dance hall in Coney Island. Al thought he was hot stuff. Young, strong, feared on the streets, with a reputation that was growing by the day. He strutted around the club in his cheap suit, thinking he owned the place, thinking he was untouchable. That night started like any other. The Harvard Inn was packed with couples dancing, men drinking illegal whiskey, and the usual crowd of small-time criminals and wannabe tough guys. Al was working the door, deciding who got in and who got turned away. He loved the power, the way people looked at him with a mixture of respect and fear. He was Alfonso Capone, and everybody in Coney Island knew his name. Then she walked in, a stunning young woman with dark hair and eyes that seemed to see right through you. She was with her date, a well-dressed man who clearly had money. Al couldn't take his eyes off her. In his arrogance, in his teenage stupidity, he thought he could have anyone he wanted. He thought his growing reputation made him irresistible. He was about to learn the most painful lesson of his life. As the woman passed by the bar where Al was standing, he made his move. With all the confidence of youth and the swagger of someone who had never been told no, he approached her. "Hey, beautiful," he said, that cocky Brooklyn accent thick in his voice. "Why don't you ditch this chump and dance with a real man?" He reached out to touch her face, to caress her cheek like he owned her. The woman stepped back, clearly uncomfortable, but Al persisted. "Come on, sweetheart, don't be shy. I'm Al Capone. Ask anyone around here. I'm somebody important." But the woman wasn't impressed. She shook her head and tried to move away, but Al grabbed her wrist. "Nobody walks away from Al Capone," he said, his voice getting harder, more threatening. What Al didn't know was that the woman's male companion wasn't just some random date. His name was Frank Galluccio, and he was connected, not just to organized crime, but to this woman in a way that made Al's advances not just inappropriate, but dangerously insulting. The woman was Frank's sister, Maria. And in the world of Italian families, in the code of honor that governed the streets, what Al had just done was unforgivable. Frank appeared beside them like a shadow. He was smaller than Al, quieter, but there was something in his eyes that should have warned the young bouncer that he was making a terrible mistake. "Take your hands off my sister," Frank said quietly, his voice deadly calm. But Al was young, stupid, and drunk on his own reputation. Instead of backing down, instead of apologizing like any smart person would have done, he doubled down. "Your sister?" Al laughed, still holding Maria's wrist. "Well, she's got good taste in men, but she could do better." He pulled Maria closer to him, ignoring her obvious distress. That's when Frank Galluccio made a move that would change Al Capone's life forever. In one fluid motion, he pulled out a knife and slashed Al across the left side of his face. The blade caught him from his left ear to the corner of his mouth, then again from his lower lip to his chin. 3 deep cuts that would heal into permanent scars. Blood poured down Al's face as he stumbled backward, releasing Maria and pressing his hands to his wounds. The club went silent. Everyone stared as the mighty Al Capone stood there bleeding, defeated, humiliated in front of everyone who had feared and respected him. Frank Galluccio calmly wiped his blade clean and helped his sister toward the exit. Before they left, he turned back to Al. "Next time," he said quietly, "show some respect." Al spent the next several weeks recovering from his wounds, but the physical scars were nothing compared to the psychological impact. For the first time in his life, Alfonso Capone had been publicly humiliated, defeated, marked permanently for his arrogance and stupidity. The 3 scars on his face would earn him the nickname Scarface for the rest of his life, a permanent reminder of the night he learned that actions have consequences. But here's what makes this story so important to understanding Al Capone's later success. Most men would have been destroyed by such public humiliation. Most men would have left town, changed their name, started over somewhere else. But Al Capone did something different. He turned his greatest shame into his greatest strength. Instead of hiding the scars, instead of being embarrassed by them, Al began to tell different stories about how he got them. Sometimes he said he got them fighting in World War I, even though he never served. Sometimes he claimed they were from a knife fight with a rival gang member who was now dead. Sometimes he said they were from protecting a woman's honor. He never, ever told the truth about that night at the Harvard Inn. But more importantly, Al learned something from Frank Galluccio that would define the rest of his criminal career. He learned about respect, not just demanding it, but earning it. He learned about family honor, about loyalty, about the difference between real power and the illusion of power. And most crucially, he learned that his reputation was everything, and that reputation could be managed, controlled, crafted like a work of art. Years later, when Al Capone was the most powerful man in Chicago, when he controlled an empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars, when politicians and police commissioners came to him for favors, he would track down Frank Galluccio. But instead of seeking revenge, instead of having him killed like everyone expected, Al did something that shocked the entire underworld. He offered Frank a job. Frank Galluccio became one of Al Capone's most trusted bodyguards, one of the few men who could approach the great Scarface without fear because he was the only man who had ever defeated Al Capone in a fight and lived to tell about it. Al kept him close, not just as a bodyguard, but as a reminder that no matter how powerful he became, no matter how many people feared him, he was still just a man who could bleed. This transformation, from the arrogant young punk who got carved up in a Coney Island bar to the criminal mastermind who could turn his greatest enemy into his most loyal protector, this is the key to understanding how Al Capone would later fool an entire nation. He learned to take his weaknesses and turn them into strengths. He learned to take his failures and rewrite them as victories. He learned that the story people believe is more important than the story that actually happened. The scars on his face became his trademark, his calling card, the thing that made him instantly recognizable. Newspaper reporters would describe them in vivid detail. Photographers would make sure they were clearly visible. The scars that should have destroyed his reputation instead became the foundation of his legend. Scarface wasn't an insult. It was a brand. And this is how Al Capone discovered the most important secret of his entire criminal career. If you can control how people see your story, you can control how they see you. If you can turn your greatest shame into your greatest strength, then nothing can ever truly defeat you. This lesson, learned in blood and humiliation on a summer night in 1917, would become the cornerstone of the double life that would make him the most famous criminal in American history. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because before Al Capone could conquer Chicago, before he could build his empire, before he could become the man who fed the hungry while murdering his enemies, he had to leave New York. The scars on his face were a constant reminder that Brooklyn knew who he really was. If he was going to reinvent himself, if he was going to become someone new, he needed to go somewhere where nobody knew Alfonso Capone, the humiliated bouncer. He needed to go somewhere where he could start fresh, where he could craft a new identity, where he could put into practice everything Johnny Torrio had taught him about keeping business separate from personal life. In 1919, Johnny Torrio called his young protege with an opportunity that would change everything. Torrio had moved to Chicago and was working with his uncle, James Big Jim Colosimo, who controlled most of the city's prostitution and gambling operations. But Torrio could see what his uncle couldn't, that prohibition was coming, and when it did, whoever controlled the liquor trade would control Chicago. He needed someone he could trust, someone smart enough to see the big picture, someone hungry enough to do whatever it took to succeed. "Come to Chicago, Al," Torrio told him over the phone. "There's opportunities here you can't imagine. But leave Alfonso Capone in Brooklyn. In Chicago, you'll be someone new." Al didn't hesitate. He packed his few belongings, said goodbye to his family, though not before promising his mother, Teresa, that he would send money home every month, a promise he would keep religiously for the rest of his life, and bought a train ticket to Chicago. As the train pulled out of Grand Central Station, as he watched the familiar streets of Brooklyn disappear behind him, Alfonso Capone made himself a promise. He would never again be the stupid, arrogant kid who got carved up in a Coney Island bar. In Chicago, he would be smarter, more careful, more strategic. He had no idea that he was about to become the most notorious criminal in American history. He had no idea that his name would become synonymous with organized crime, that movies would be made about his life, that nearly a century later people would still be fascinated by his story. All he knew was that Chicago represented a fresh start, a chance to put everything Johnny Torrio had taught him into practice, a chance to build something bigger than anything the small-time hoods of Brooklyn could ever imagine. The train ride to Chicago took 18 hours. 18 hours for Al to think, to plan, to decide who he was going to be in this new city. By the time the train pulled into Union Station, Alfonso Capone had made his decision. In Chicago, he wouldn't just be another street tough trying to earn respect through violence. In Chicago, he would be a businessman who happened to work in illegal enterprises, but a businessman nonetheless. He would dress well, speak well, carry himself like a man of importance. He would be generous to those who deserved it and ruthless to those who crossed him. He would be a family man, a public figure, a man who contributed to his community. And when violence was necessary, because in his line of work violence was always eventually necessary, it would be calculated, strategic, purposeful. Never again would he let emotion control his actions. As Al Capone stepped off that train in Chicago in 1919, he was already beginning to craft the double life that would make him legend. The scared young man with the slashed face was gone forever. In his place was someone new, someone more dangerous, someone who understood that in America you could be anyone you had the courage to pretend to be. Chicago was waiting for him, and Al Capone was ready for Chicago. The city that would make him famous was about to meet the man who would change it forever. But first, Al had to learn the rules of Chicago's game. He had to understand the delicate balance of corruption that kept the city running, the intricate web of relationships between criminals, politicians, police, and businessmen that made Chicago unique among American cities. He had to figure out how to navigate a world where your best friend could become your worst enemy overnight, where today's ally could be tomorrow's corpse. Johnny Torrio was there to meet him at the station, and as they drove through the streets of Chicago in Torrio's expensive automobile, Al got his first real look at what would soon become his kingdom. This wasn't Brooklyn. This was bigger, more sophisticated, more corrupt, and infinitely more profitable than anything he had ever imagined. "Welcome to Chicago, Al," Torrio said as they drove past the bustling downtown district. "If you're smart, if you're careful, and if you listen to everything I teach you, this city will make you rich beyond your wildest dreams. But remember what I told you back in New York. Never let them see the real you. Give them a version of yourself that they can admire, fear, or love, but never let them see the man behind the curtain." Al nodded, understanding completely. The greatest performance of his life was about to begin.